A lot of times today, we dads don't always step up to the plate like we should. We don't always show love and grace to our children the way God does to us. We don't always respond with love and compassion for our kids when they come confessing to us when they have done something wrong. Usually we're too quick to get angry and to take away their privileges. Now, I'm not saying that we should never discipline our children, because we should, and there are times for that. But rather, I'm saying we should always be ready to extend grace to our children and others, because this is what God does to us. The other week when Benjamin Fogler preached, he talked about the different views we have of God. And one of those views that he mentioned was called the employer view. The view that where we think that God only uses the best. That only if you are good and you don't have anything against you, can you be used by God. In other words, if we think that we've ever messed up, then God won't love us or use us. And if that were the case, then the only person that God could have ever used is Jesus, because he was without sin. When we read the Bible, we discover that God doesn't operate that way. Throughout both the Old and New Testaments, we see people who messed up in their lives, but yet were still used by God. For example, Noah. We remember Noah as the one who built the ark after God had decided that he was going to flood the earth to rid it of all evil. Genesis 6:9 reads, Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time, and he walked with God. Noah was pretty much the only follower of God left in his generation. Everyone else had turned their backs on God and had turned to evil. After the flood waters receded, Noah and his family exited the ark and began to repopulate the earth. He was a farmer, and so he planted a vineyard and then began to produce wine. One day he got drunk and lay uncovered in his tent. Uncovered means he was naked. He didn't have any clothes on. Even though he was a righteous man, he messed up. And that was a poor example of godliness for his sons. Even though he was righteous, he messed up, but God still loved him and cared for him. Another example is Abraham. Of when Abraham is traveling through to where God has sent him and said, there's a land I want you to go to. And as they're traveling through one of these foreign lands, he tells his wife, I'm going to tell everybody that you are my sister, and you're not my wife. And so Abraham lies to this one king because he was afraid for his own life, and he was afraid that he was going to be killed. And so even though Abraham lied, God still used him to become the father of the nation of Israel. What about Moses? You know, when we think about him, we think about the movie The Ten Commandments and Moses leading the Israelites out of Egypt. And we think of that movie, The Ten Commandments, where they're at the Red Sea. And God has commanded Moses to lift up his hands in order to part the Red Sea and to hold those up so that the Israelites can pass through on dry ground. And he does that. And then when they're all across, God says, bring your hand back across the waters so that they will close in. And in doing so, the waters flowed back and drowned the Egyptians. Do you remember the secret from Moses' past? Turn over to Exodus 2. And let's look at this secret that he has. Exodus 2, verses 11 and 12. One day after Moses had grown up, he went out to where his own people were and watched them at their hard labor. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Glancing this way and that, and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Moses was a murderer, yet God had grace and compassion for him and used him to bring the Israelites out of their bondage and to lead them to the promised land. Someone else who messed up in their lives but still was used by God is David. The Scriptures tells us that David was a man after God's heart. Sometime after David became king of Israel, he committed adultery with Bathsheba. And when Bathsheba sends word that she is pregnant, David gives order for her husband Uriah to be killed in battle in order to cover up his sins. David sinned many times in his life, and he is quick to confess them. David never took God's forgiveness lightly or his blessing for granted. And in return, God never held back from David either his forgiveness or the consequences of his actions. David experienced the joy of forgiveness, even when he had to suffer the consequences of his own sins. And perhaps the most notorious person in the Bible to experience God's grace is Paul. Paul was very religious. He knew the Scriptures extremely well. And he sincerely believed that the Christian movement was dangerous to Judaism. He hated the Christian faith, and he persecuted Christians without mercy. In Acts 8:1, we're told that Paul was at the stoning of Stephen, giving approval to his death. But Paul, one day when he was traveling to Damascus looking for Christians, he had a personal encounter with Jesus. After that encounter, he was filled with the Holy Spirit and was chosen by God to be the messenger to the Gentiles for the good news of Jesus Christ. In my own life, there have been times when I have messed up and have experienced grace from my Father. One morning when I still had my driver's permit, I was out delivering newspapers with my dad in his truck. One driveway I was backing out of, and I managed to scrape a telephone pole and put a dent in the side of the truck. Dad was upset, of course, but he didn't yell at me. He just said I needed to be more careful when I was backing up. Another time when I experienced His grace was on Father's Day, 1979. I had gone to Sunday school that morning, and then after Sunday school I left and went home to get some things, and then I was traveling out to my grandparents' home to help them get ready for a family reunion later that afternoon. The vehicle I had was a little post office Jeep, and as I was going out the road, I reached over to put something down in the floorboard. And when I did that, I drove myself off the road. When I set back up, it was just at the same time as the Jeep was going into the ditch, and when it did, it went in and came up, and I hit the steering wheel and kind of got myself dazed. Eventually, the ditch bank got steep, and the Jeep flipped over, landed upright, and it threw me out the passenger door. I wasn't wearing my seatbelt. I was dazed but alert, and the man who saw me wreck had me lie down on the side of the road, and I told him who I was and where he could find Mom and Dad and that they were at the church. Soon after, Mom and Dad arrived and discovered that I was all right, had just a few minor injuries and bumps and bruises. So Mom stayed with me and went to the hospital in the ambulance with me, and then Dad went on back to preach that morning. After the service was over, Dad came on over to the hospital.